Hello, folks. Can you
Good
hear me,
evening,
Chris?
ladies and gentlemen.
Excellent. It's Monday. You know what that means, Chris?
Monday Night Monsters, episode 04.
04. Excellent, excellent. I'm excited about this. A little. We were talking before the show came on that this being our last program in the month of March, it's very fitting that we do something. We tip our hats to the Irish, and we do something that's Irish and Celtic inspired. So, you have any lineage in your family tree there of the Irish, my friend?
I actually do. My last name is Italian, as I'm sure it's fairly obvious, but actually the other side of my family is the McClures, and we are from both
McClure.
Scotland and Ireland. My family from about the mid 1700s escaped out of Scotland, landed in Northern Ireland for a while, and things got a little hot under the Tootsies there, so they moved to America. But no, I've got a lot of Scottish and Irish ancestry in me, even a little bit of Viking blood running around somewhere in there. So no,
There
I'm
you
very
go.
excited about Latter-day St. Patty's Day episode.
Absolutely. For Christmas, I got a ancestry kit. Okay, because my last name Murphy. I'm assuming it's going to come back 80%
It's a good
Irish.
Jewish name.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it comes back. It comes back 28% Scottish and only 23% Irish.
Uh-oh.
So yeah, I feel a little bit bad about that, but we still have that Celtic in us, and regardless of what our surnames are, this is indeed a month where everybody can be Irish for a little bit.
Absolutely. And it's a subject that I've always absolutely loved. I've always been fascinated by tales of the fair folk, of
Mm.
the fairies and the sprites and all the different curious creatures of especially northern British Isles lore, Ireland and Scotland. And of course, we're going to be covering the dark side of Irish and Scottish lore this evening with the dark fae, or what is sometimes referred to as the unseelie court,
That's right.
uh,
And you
the,
made
the
a good point as well
naughtier
too.
of the fairy breed.
That's right. You made a good point though too, because this was brought to the Americas. This was something that was brought over, and in places like Appalachia, these kind of stories now became took on a life of their own. But I think that we're going to get to a lot of the root elements from a lot of American legends whenever we deal with the Fae from the British Isles.
Absolutely. And it's funny. I think that probably, of course, when people hear the word fairy tends to make people think of cute little sprites with their wings dancing around in the daisies and things like that. But there is a very dark side to Celtic fairy folklore, and the dark fae represent some of really the scariest creatures in all of folklore. And this evening we're going to be covering, I think, some of the most frightening of these monsters. Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, if you're here watching us live, we're absolutely delighted to answer questions whenever we can. Sometimes it takes us a minute or two to notice your questions in the comments. Please be patient. We'll try to get to them. But don't forget to post your questions. And of course, if you're enjoying the show, do not forget to subscribe. Hit that like button. Let us know that you're enjoying the ride for us. That it's big help so that we can continue to get viewers and bring you this show every week.
Absolutely. And we're also lucky to have Ken DeCosta in the house as well, too. And he's behind the scenes. So he will probably not let any
He's a man in
question
the
go
chair.
unanswered. That's right.
Sometimes he's got to kick us in the shin to get us to recognize these questions, but if it takes that, that's what it takes. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
all right.
Yeah, I was going to make another very interesting point about Irish folklore, and it completely slipped my mind. It will probably come back to me. I think it was probably going to be a pretty good point, too. And I can't remember what it was now.
Well, I'm going to imagine something fascinating, and
Yeah,
and
exactly.
hopefully
Yes,
it'll
that's
occur to you
exactly
between now
right.
and
That's
then.
right.
So,
That's right. Yes, no. Oh, no, I know what I was going to say. I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia here. Did you know that Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien, was
of
so
course.
taken by the world of the fairy that he wanted his elves in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to be fairies, but the Victorians so ruined that impression of the fairies he could never use that. He does allude to fairies throughout the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but when we think of the fairies, like you said, they were much more ambivalent than the Marilyn Monroe with diaphanous wings that we have brought to us now. But it was the Victorians. It was this kind of harkening back to an England that it never was that made these fairies into something that little girls now play with in paper dolls and
Of
things.
course.
But I think that the origin, once we start getting into the origin, right into the root of this kind of stuff, it's a much more fascinating world than Peter Pan's world.
Absolutely, and in fact, many of the sort of creatures that we're going to deal with tonight have a kind of an ambiguous nature themselves. Sometimes they are seen as evil, sometimes they're seen as good. Sometimes it's difficult to predict what they do. But when they misbehave, often they misbehave in the most heinous of ways. Now, actually, just a few days ago, I watched a little bit as homework, but also just because it's always nice to watch this time of year, a movie that some of you folks may be familiar with, especially if you're old fogies like us, called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. This was a late 1960s Disney film about an old man in a little Irish village who happens to sort of consort with the fairies and the leprechauns. But this movie itself takes a little bit of a dark turn towards the end, and you start to meet some of the darker and spookier aspects of Celtic lore. So if anyone ever has a chance to watch, it's an incredibly charming, very classic Disney film, showing a couple of shots from it here. But it's called Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and I highly recommend it. I don't want to talk too much about the fairies and sprites that he encounters during the film, because I don't want to give away the ghost here too soon for what we're going to be talking about this evening. But I think, I've always believed, one of the strangest and creepiest of all the creatures in Irish and sort of just general Celtic folklore is the changeling. Now, strange thing about the sort of dark side of fairy, and we mentioned a minute ago that in somewhere in probably the 15 or 1600s, someone came up with the idea that the world of the fae, the fairy, these supernatural creatures, were divided into two courts: the Seelie court, which basically meant the prosperous, the happy, the upright and virtuous fairies, and the unseelie court, which by its definition means the evil, the dark, and the mischievous fairies. And we're going to be dealing with the unseelie court tonight. But one of the things that fairies on both sides of the aisle have often been known for throughout history is stealing children. Now, in the realm of good fairies, they steal the children and raise them among their own, and actually use them to sort of enrich the blood of the fairy community, which may not be the sort of thing that a parent wants to hear, but at least it's not entirely an evil pursuit. On the flip side, however, changelings are fairies who take the place of children, and they appear to be perfectly normal human babies, but they are inherently evil, and as they grow and mature, the sort of dark fairy side of their nature becomes more and more evident. And I've always found the idea of fairies stealing into your home during the night to steal your children to be certainly creepy. And I guess you can imagine that it's a little bit of a cautionary tale for probably young mothers, which is how many of these stories would have come about. But so it's, as I say, one of probably the creepiest of all the fairy legends.
And they also tend to be very sickly. So you can imagine a new mother or new parents putting up with a baby that cries 24 hours a day and having all these kind of health needs and everything, because the worlds are blending in and it's just not fitting in very well. But as you said, I mean, we could look at Shakespeare, and by the time the Elizabethan period comes around, and we can see a changeling in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Whenever it was being raised, as you said, in the court and everything was happy-go-lucky. But the idea of the changeling coming in and actually disrupting somebody's life, that is the nightmare about it. It's the nightmare of not only having children. For those people that have children out there, it is both a blessing and a curse at the same time. I have 5 of them, so I can speak about that. But no, and especially whenever you have an agricultural community with a child that eats far more than the other ones or cannot do the kind of work, it's natural, I think, for the parents to think, this is not of our ilk. This has to be some sort of plague brought upon us, and therefore we have to blame the fairy realm.
It's interesting to note that according to folklore, there were different ways that you could get the fairies to bring your own child back and sort of switch them up. And one of them was apparently there were 2. easy ways. One is if you could convince your changeling, if you caught on to them, convince them to laugh, which seems like it would be a comparatively easy thing to do. Apparently, the laughter somehow broke the spell, and they'd be forced to bring your child back. But the far darker one was that you could torture the fairy changeling until it agreed to swap back for your child, and there implications that in the cases of children who seem to be overly misbehaving, that it could even have led to cases of child abuse. And so it's a little
Sure,
bit of a cautionary
absolutely.
tale on that as well. Kind of a horrifying thought if you really think about it. And I imagine, we always like to try to tie these things into real world examples and reasons these folk tales may have can't come about. But you have to imagine that that mothers, especially, in that age, who have stayed home with their children quite a lot, sometimes I think every mother in the world thinks, you're not my child, this misbehaving sort of, hellion of a child, and that they might actually have become convinced that their children were possessed. And people have even suggested that the stories of the changelings was a way for the church to encourage mothers to get their children baptized. That they basically would suggest to them that if your children aren't baptized, that they're likely to be swapped out for fairy changelings, and sort of plague your life. So interesting concept anyway.
And also think of this from the father's point of view as well, too. This is not my child kind of thing as well. That's something that's haunted us for years and years, to kind of say that, this is not my progeny,
Does it look like the fairy, or does it look like a milkman? That's the way.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
I will tell you that.
I'm sorry, you were saying?
Oh, no, I was just reading. Was it bad to just keep your changeling?
Well, I suppose the idea, that's a fascinating question. I guess the idea was that as the changeling matured, its malevolent tendencies tended to come out. And what you probably want to imagine is that the changeling concept certainly still exists in modern society. We see it portrayed in different ways in horror films often enough. The evil child film or evil child horror story is something fairly common, and probably one of the most notorious changeling stories in modern horror fiction, while not connected to Celtic folklore, would be The Omen. Which is the idea of having the Antichrist swapped out for your child. And I suppose in a way that this is a very, very similar story. And you can imagine that as Damien Thorne, the child in the Omen film, grew to maturity, his evil ended up resulting in murders and all sorts of chaos. So I would say that in your, probably ideally speaking, you wouldn't want to keep your changeling around.
Right.
I was going to point out a moment ago that Jeff Hilton had chimed in. Hi, Jeff. Good to see you back again. That Fae were often blamed for a lot of the things that went wrong. And so it certainly was very common for people to try to appease the fairies, good and bad, that might inhabit your neighborhood. Because if the milk turned sour or the fire wouldn't light, it was always a fairy's doing. And so, yeah, they were a very easy way to blame the ills that surrounded you on the supernatural world.
Right. And then, later on, whenever fairies fell out of fashion, just blame the lady down the road.
Exactly. And in those cases, they would often be accused of being a witch, and there wasn't really a whole lot of difference there. So.
Exactly. This is another image of a changeling, is it not?
It is indeed, yes. I thought I'd zoom in a little bit so that you can see the sort of hideous child growing to unnatural proportions and sort of an exaggerated view of the changeling idea.
Right. And again,
getting back to fun finding these images, by the way. So
that's right. And again, getting back to the idea that this is an agricultural community with just enough food to go around, and you're bringing something monstrous into the family that's going to be eating like three, as much as 3 people. That's a very, very hard hit on a family at that time. But I've studied the idea of the changeling pretty extensively, and there is a really sad commentary that's a possibility in the anthropological world. And I'll just get to that real quick. It'll take me about a minute to explain it. It suggested that whenever the Celtic people began to be supplanted by other conquerors, such as the Romans, that the inhabitants would have been marginalized on the fringe of this new society. They would have been converted basically into little more than hunter-gatherer groups again, having to hide out from this imposing force that was coming into their world. And one of the suggestions was because it was so difficult in those living conditions to raise your own child, you would actually go into the encampment of a Roman legion or whatever, and you would put your child into that encampment, hoping that it would be taken and have a better life. That's a very sad commentary if you think about that. And the peoples that were conquered, the Celtic peoples that were conquered, it may make sense to take a Roman baby into your world at that point, because it would have a better health, a better more of a sturdy constitution than the child that you had just given birth to. So there are interesting possibilities from where this came about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, a concurrent theme, as I said, in a lot of these stories too, is having your children snatched away. I think probably is one of the most frightful things that any parent can endure, and so it does tend to surface in a lot of fairy folklore. The idea, and another one of the stranger creatures in folklore tends to be filled with shapeshifters of various sorts. And one thing about the Fae folk is that they are frequently tricksters of one form or another. And one of the strangest, I think, that I've ever read about is the Kelpie. Now, these Kelpies frequently would appear by riversides and lakesides as a beautiful, glossy black horse, the sort of thing that a wild horse would have been not only very valuable, but also very enticing. People considered horses exotic and beautiful, and would frequently lure unsuspecting people, including children. And if the child came up and tried to ride the horse or even pet the horse, that it would literally, their hands would sometimes stick to the animal, or they would climb aboard them and not be able to get off. And the creature would then literally drag them down into the river or the lake to be drowned. And so it's a curious one, because they're referred to often in folklore as water horses. And you may see that come up in other contexts from time to time. But such a strange idea that in Celtic folklore, you have this connection frequently between horses and water. And even with goddesses like Epona, you have these connections, and I've never quite understood where that connection would come in. But the Kelpie is a very common, especially in Scottish legend, a very, very common sort of a hazard that is supposed to take human form sometimes, but much more often the form of a horse. And they could appear in hideous forms as well, but they would then drag you into the water and potentially devour you. So I don't know if you know too much about the history, or curious your thoughts on the origins of just such a creature.
Well, it's interesting because whenever you look at Greco-Roman mythology, Poseidon or Neptune, his signature animal also is a horse, which is very interesting because it's the god of the sea. You wouldn't expect horses. So there was some anthropological notions out there that the breaking of the waves coming on the shore seemed to be like galloping horses coming upon you. That's one way to look at it. Or the breaking of the waves appear to be a horse's mane blowing in the wind. There are different ways to look at this, but there is something curious from a rather cryptozoological point of view if you think about this. Because whenever people talk about Loch Ness monster sightings, or even in the New World, talk about sightings of the Lake Champlain monster, they always mention the idea that it had a horse's head, which may mean that people were witnessing these things in antiquity and kind of blending it with their own mythology. That's a possibility there. You always have to keep your mind open on that. But if you visit places like Loch Ness or the various types of lakes in Scotland that purportedly have these kelpies inhabiting them, these water horses, these river monsters, it seems to me that it's the personification of the water themselves. If you go to Loch Ness and there's even a very slight breeze going through that glen, the waves become very disturbed very quickly, and they sort of undulate like a snake. So to kind of put that together with already this romance of the horse involvement with the water, I think that you can see where a lot of these things come into play. And as you said too, this could also be a warning just for children not to go gallivanting on a horse whenever you want to as well.
I think a lot of these stories evolve from cautionary tales as well.
Sure.
And one thing that is often, I think, difficult for modern audiences to completely understand. And I think it'll show up a little bit later as we speak about some more of these creatures. Is that the distinction between different creatures in these old folklore isn't as cut and dry as we tend to imagine it today. I mean, today when we imagine a werewolf or a vampire or a ghost or a or anything, we tend to think of them in very, very specific boxes and what abilities they have and what they look like. But in older folklore, the lines between these kind of creatures was frequently very blurry. And so things like Jeff, I think, just mentioned a moment ago, naiads and dryads. You have the Loch Ness monster itself, water horses, kelpies, selkies, the shape-shifting seal people of Irish folklore, and all of these had these places where the lines between them were very blurry. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we tend to we basically tend to impose certain mythical aspects on almost anything we see. And sometimes it's like a salad bar. You pick and choose which aspects of the folklore you want, and you may create a new creature altogether from that. And so the idea of Roman mythology with horses associated with Poseidon, Irish mythology, even Norse mythology has these strange horse monsters. There's one that I thought about talking about tonight. I wasn't going to originally bring it up, but a really interesting creature that comes from Scandinavian mythology called a Nuka-levi. And it's a very strange name, but it's a demonic spirit that appears in the form of a horse and rider. But if you get close enough to see it, which by the way is a bad idea because these are very vicious spirits, if you get close enough to see it, you realize that it's not a horse and a rider. It's a creature that appears to be both in one. And as many of these evil spirits were, it was an eater of man, a consumer of flesh. And so you would never want to get close enough to learn, but you would see this big-headed, almost bulbously oversized head and appearance of a body basically growing from the body of this horse-like creature, and quite grim, but in a way similar in many ways to kelpies, regardless of the fact that the Nuka-levi was not associated with water.
Right. The interesting thing about horses, we have such an affinity towards them in the 20th century. But at one time these were war machines, and I think that this is a commentary upon that as well too. These were fearsome things. I mean, up until relatively recently, before the industrial age, these were scary things, and it really changed the world as we know it, especially on how you were deemed as a soldier, being part of the cavalry or what have you. So a lot of times, whenever horses are introduced into a culture, there was no kind of lovey-dovey type of association with them. They were here as war machines to do a job for an imposing force. And I think that those kind of ideas also are to play here, where once they're very beautiful, majestic creatures, but in the wrong hands, they can be very, very dangerous.
So Jeff, wasn't that a horse with glowing red eyes? I think in a lot of the folklore you have things like that. I don't know if that's specific to things like kelpies, Nuka-levis, or anything, but I know that the sort of the sinister glowing eyes is something that tends to show up in a great deal of folklore. Much of this also comes, and yes, Mary Beth, by the way, is very much like a centaur, although in this case with the Nuka-levi, it actually appears to be a horse and rider, not just the torso of a man coming from the head of a horse. So similar in some ways to a centaur, but it's kind of a centaur designed by the devil. I mean, really just a dreadful creature.
That's right. Well, looking over your right shoulder right now, I see back, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow too.
You can see that horseman back there, yeah.
A more modern time too. The idea of that horse and rider, or the horse, this kind of horse from hell, it still haunts our imagination even now. And I think that we were correct in saying it definitely was a bridge from this Celtic world that brought this kind of fear into our collective unconscious.
Well, hold that thought, because we'll be addressing that before the night is out. But before we get into any more horses from hell, another creature, one that is maybe one of the most ambiguous creatures, I think, in all fairy folklore, and one that has a lot of positive or mischievous, is the Pooka. Now, the Pooka, which exists in almost all Northern European folklore in one form or another, often with very similar variations on the name. In fact, our own word, the boogeyman, boogie, boggins, boggarts, and things like that, all come from derivations of the word puka, is another shape-shifting spirit. The thing about the Pookas is that, like a lot of fairy spirits, they could potentially be beneficial, but they were often much more malicious. And while they were sometimes referred to as tricksters, the tricks they played could be devastating, whether it was all your crops rotting away, or turning your child into a rabbit that you would end up catching in a snare. Dreadful, and very malicious tricks. And the puka is one that even the name sounds so innocent and it sounds so gentle. And frequently their appearance was like a large black hare, a large black rabbit. And so their appearance could be very mischievous there, and sort of almost cute, but they could be deadly, truly deadly, dangerous adversaries. And so the puka is, I think, one of the most frightening, because it's the one you tend to suspect the least of being evil. If you encountered a puka in the woods, children would likely think that they were adorable. They could seem fully innocent and then turn out to be entirely malicious. Right. In fact, the other thing about pukas is that they're also as shapeshifters, they tend to be the ones who are most reflected in other fairy types. In other words, when you hear about brownies and sprites and pixies and things like this, all of these are like basically subsets of the puka, these mischievous creatures, which, if you got on their good side, could be very beneficial to you. But if you got on their bad side, or didn't follow sometimes some very specific instructions on how to appease them, they could turn your life into a living hell.
Well, yeah, even if you were on their good side, it's still not they're not going to remain that way, because you can screw up just by saying thank you to them. They
Exactly.
didn't like to be acknowledged. So even saying thank you and something as gracious as that could ruin your entire world.
One of the things that you find in a lot of old Celtic folklore is putting out little tributes for the fairies, specifically Pookas, like a bowl of milk or honey, or leaving little treats out for them, which you do find reflected in a lot of other forms of folklore. Everything from the way we trick or treat at Halloween to leaving cookies out for Santa Claus are a kind of a latter day evolution of this idea of leaving a treat or an appeasement for this fairy spirit. Because I suppose, as we all remember, even with Santa Claus is often referred to as a jolly old elf, and that there's a great deal of fairy folklore connected to the Santa Claus myth. And we all know that Santa Claus is not necessarily always your friend, is that if you don't leave out cookies, or if you just misbehave, that you can end up on his bad side too. And that could range from anything from coal in your stocking to a visit from Krampus, and neither of those were a very good outcome for a naughty child at Christmas time.
And he's always watching too, which is very creepy if you think about it.
You have to admit, the Santa Claus myth, while it's very sweet sometimes, just like any fairy myth, has a very, very creepy element to it. Right. Sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake. I'm not sure anybody wants that.
That's right. But yeah, I don't understand who would not want to be around a 5-foot-tall chinchilla, because that's what the puka reminds me of. That would be great. And they like to be naked. So if you offer them clothes, that's another way to get on their bad side, because I think clothes represents a type of domestication. And these things are always meant to be wild. They're not to be confined. If they bleed over into our world and we come into contact with them, that's one thing. And if they're, like you said, if they're showing some sort of benevolence to us, that's great. But it's not one of those things where we want to have an ongoing interaction with them. If we encounter them, great, but let's keep on moving on.
And actually, you bring up a good point with the idea of clothes. Although some fairies actually are known to wear specific clothing, it still boils down to one of the most core elements of fairy folklore. It's the great ongoing war between nature and humanity. Fairies are nature spirits. They are the sort of raw element of nature, and the sort of the civilization of man, as it encroaches and then we build roads, always encroaches on nature, and as a result puts us at odds with the fair folk. And as I think it's one of the most common things that you see is that that it becomes this war between the two classes, the sort of human class and the supernatural class, the war between man and nature. But there are definitely fairies who not only wear clothing but are known for it. And I think probably one of the most dreadful of all of those is one that I'm fascinated by, which is the red cap goblin. Now, red caps are probably one of the most well-known of all fairy types. In fact, when you see cartoons of fairy creatures, they are frequently little chubby men wearing like homespun coats and a red cap. But that comes from a very, very sinister chapter of fairy folklore, because these murderous goblins were, again, they were man-eaters, and they were murderous little creatures that would dip their hats in the blood of their victims. And it's actually said that if a red cap's hat dries out, if the blood dries, that they will die. They will basically cease to exist, and so they always have to be on the hunt for new victims. And
Yeah,
so
perpetually dying. Yeah, perpetually dyeing their hat in the blood of those. And usually, in a lot of folklore, they're found along, traveling roads, where people would be out. So this is also a warning to stay off the roads at night, kind of like staying off the moors at night. But the idea that there's something out there waiting for us in the shadows that we have not quite mastered. The entire world, and whenever the sun goes down, that's the abode of the other. I think that shows here in the red cap, and I'm sure a lot of people have been waylaid and murdered by outlaws and bandits waiting. But it's always kind of great to have a boogeyman there in the form of the red cap, because people can always think, I'm not afraid of a robber or anything, but there's something about that little guy that needs to dye his hat in my blood that keeps me in at night.
Indeed. Now, there's a little bit of a fun twist to this story, which is that there's one very particular red cap that is world famous, or I should say, very widely famous in Scottish folklore. Probably the most well-known of all the red cap stories is one of a creature called Robin the Red Cap, or Red Cap Robin, and this dates back to the 14th century. Now, in the 14th century, there was there's a castle that's just a little bit north of the Scottish border, and a lot of the red cap stories come from the borderlands between England and Scotland. And this particular red cap was summoned as a familiar to a man by the name of Lord Soulis. Now, Soulis was a Scottish baron who apparently allied himself with the English in the War for Scottish independence. And Lord Soulis was in conflict with Robert the Bruce, who was the High King of Scotland at the time, and apparently used the infernal powers of this summoned familiar, this Robin Redcap, in order to gain immortality and all these dark powers, and wanted to use them and bring them to bear against Robert the Bruce and against the people of Scotland. He was eventually, Lord Soulis was eventually captured, imprisoned, but he couldn't be killed by traditional means. And so the folk tale connected with him is after he'd been in prison for quite a few years, and they couldn't kill him by any traditional means, they wrapped him in hot lead and boiled him to death in a cauldron. That was the only way that they could finally kill this wicked baron. But they never caught Robin Redcap. They never caught his little familiar. And Robin Redcap is still said to haunt the ruins of Hermitage Castle to this day. And Hermitage Castle still stands there. You can see it's quite an imposing edifice. And this image next to it of Robin Redcap is claimed to be the dried husk of the creature himself. Of course, I don't believe he was caught quite so easily. I imagine that that's probably a clever fake, but still, people do claim that it is the dried out living husk of the Redcap demon.
Love it. I would like to have that in my house.
I have to admit, he's cuter than Annabelle.
That's right. That's right. But also, it's just kind of like the Jenny Hanover. Whenever people wanted to have proof of mermaids, this is a good way to say, hey, you don't have to believe me. It's right up there. Go take a look for it yourself.
Absolutely, you have the Fiji mermaid, and you have all these different creatures, and actually even like the withered monkey's paws that you sometimes find on display in certain curiosity shops that are claimed to be absolutely authentic. Again, I'm not entirely convinced, although it's an attractive little creature there, but I'm not entirely convinced that that's genuine. Whoever made it, I will give them a lot of props for creativity, though.
That's right. That's right. And also it instills into us what a fairy looks like, because they were always very nebulous creatures, kind of, whether they're just made up of a frequency or whether they take on actual shape. It's this time when people start becoming very creative, and we can now get the images of what a fairy looks like on our brain.
Indeed. Now, Jeff, you just pointed out that there are folklore from all over the world about little people, basically these small races. And one thing that people have often pointed out is that the Picts, one of the earliest races that inhabited the northern British Isles, that the Pictish people were supposed to be very diminutive and very small, and that they may have actually given rise to some of the legends of the fair folk when the Vikings and the Saxons, the Gauls, and all these different tribes. Because the one thing about the British Isles is it is a melting pot of conquering races, and one comes in, conquers the next. Just about the time that conquering race settles in, starts to feel like they're at home, another conquering race came along, and that just happened time and time again through history. But the Picts were one of the oldest and one of the most curious, sort of a very, very old pagan race, and they may in fact be the origin of many of those original stories. Now, I do have a little personal note in terms of the story of Red Cap Robin. In about a month, I'll be actually in England, and unfortunately, I'll be there over the course of a Monday night. So I'm not sure whether I'll be broadcasting to be with you guys live that night from England if I've got connection, or whether you're going to have to find a co-host for that night. But I'll be actually up on the Scottish border and plan on visiting Hermitage Castle myself, and so I'll see if I can get an interview with Red Cap Robin, and
that would be awesome.
That'd be a good scoop. So I'm going to keep my eyes peeled and hope that I'm not murdered that night, and we'll see what we can do.
Definitely get some pictures.
Now, this next one is a fascinating one, and it's fairly new to me. This was your catch, Ron. Is that of course vampire folklore exists all over the world in one form or another. And Irish and British Isles vampire folklore is not extremely common, but there are legends that connect vampire-like creatures, and apparently one of them is connected to one of the Fae. And now I do not speak a word of Gaelic, and so actually pronouncing Drachfola, which would probably be how I would want to say it, but I believe that Ron, you were the one who pointed out that it sounds remarkably like Dracula, and that it is supposed to be a spirit, a blood-drinking spirit of some kind, said to inhabit certain places, including a castle, Irish castle near Killarney, which is called Dun Drachfula, which literally means the fort of tainted blood. And certainly that's a fascinating story. Now, I had not heard about this before you brought it up, so I'm glad that you did, but it is intriguing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, seeing that Bram Stoker was indeed Irish, I think that he was a masterful storyteller. And the reason why the story Dracula works so effectively is that he does blend mythologies from different countries. So he makes it universal rather than geographically specific. And I think the idea of something out there, as I said, even with the Red Cap or any of these other fairies, something right beyond our margins, right over our walls, something on the periphery that is out there. Now, of course, these Irish Draculas, these Irish little fairy creatures, again, they haunt the isolated roadways out in the middle of nowhere. But they're also attached to a particular domicile as well, too. So whenever we think about a castle, we think of the Castle Dracula, but we also think about these creatures associated with a castle as well, too. So I think that what Stoker did, and I do believe, whenever you look at the text of Dracula, most certainly he is pulling on Vlad the Impaler. Of course he is. We can see that textually. But I think a lot of the things that really give us goosebumps about this story is the idea of what these vampires can do. And we get to the idea of being capable of changing shapes, being shapeshifters. And also we have in the book Dracula as well, too, the stealing of children, the idea that the vampire can become vaporous, just like fairies are known to do as well. This all has to do with the idea of the fairy realm. And I think that what we have here with Dracula is a blending of two different worlds into one seamless creation, which is very unique and which is the reason why we read it to this very day.
Well, I certainly think it's more than possible that he would have heard folk tales of this kind when he was a child. I know that during the writing of Dracula, he wasn't spending a great deal of time in Ireland at that point, but he did spend some time up in Scotland. There's Slains Castle up in northern Scotland, which is said to have inspired the actual physical layout and appearance of Castle Dracula. And of course, he wrote some of the most intriguing chapters of Dracula when he was staying in Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, which is actually where I'll be heading to in about a month from now. But there is an element of this that I think is true as well, which is I believe that some of these legends, while the legends themselves are authentic, may be being tweaked in the aftermath of the book Dracula to sort of seem a little bit more specific to the story. And most of one of them, as soon as you actually brought up the idea of Irish vampires, one of them that sprung to mind is a story of a high chieftain called Abertach. Now, Abertach, back, I guess this would have been, date-wise, I can't even tell you. I'm sure that this would be like 11th or 12th century or so, was supposedly an incredibly cruel Irish chieftain who was the absolute bane of his people. And after a certain point, his cruelty became so extreme that the people, I think this was around Killarney or so, that the people of his village, of his kingdom, pleaded with another local chieftain to kill him, to slay him. So this chieftain, sometimes referred to as, I believe it's sometimes associated with a Finn MacCool, but that's possibly a later addition as well, confronted the chieftain, slew him, and they buried him. A few days later, there he was wandering around the countryside again, enacting his cruelty upon the people. And so the chieftain, the rival chieftain, was called upon again to slay him a second time. That didn't stick, and Abertach once again rose from the grave and began to plague his people. Now, what's interesting about this story is that nowadays it is frequently referred to as kind of the Irish Dracula, because they say they eventually had to slay him with a sword made of either yew or hawthorn. And interestingly enough, the picture that's shown here is the actual folkloric grave of Abertach, and that tree that's growing there is a hawthorn tree, and it does occur in vampire folklore. So the idea that is apparently he consulted either a local druid, if you believe some of the older versions of the myth, or a Christian priest, if you believe some of the later versions of the myth, who said that he could only be slain with a sword made of hawthorn or yew, slayed the Abertach, and had to bury him head down. So he was originally buried like a traditional chieftain, which is not laying flat, but rather feet down, standing up in a regal position. But they reversed him, so he was head down and feet up in his grave, piled stones on top of his grave, and supposedly the sword of hawthorn that slayed him grew into this magnificent tree. So he's an intriguing story, and one that does have a great deal of historical background, because we know that Abertach in some form or another did exist, and the chieftain who slain him did as well. But the vampiric elements of the story people have added later, which is the idea that when he was rising from the grave, he was coming and demanding blood from his people and things like that. So it's sometimes hard to find where I would call the more traditional vampiric aspects. He was certainly a revenant and in a way preying on his people, but I feel like these myths sometimes get elaborated on to match our current view of something, what we would consider to be a vampire.
Yeah, I think that as well too. Whenever I was studying this tale, it seems to have a lot more fairy aspects in it at the very beginning, and a lot more vampiric aspects as we move forward in time. The hawthorn is a very interesting tree because in fairy folklore, that is associated with fairies. And getting back to the idea of the changeling, if you do have your children taken, one of the ways to get them back is to find a fairy hill and burn a hawthorn tree on top of it, either on Halloween or on the summer solstice. That's another way to get your children back, because it's kind of like a key that opens up the door to the other world. So the idea of the hawthorn. So if we have that already in the the previous tale of the chieftain there. I think that we're getting back into far more ancient elements of the fairy that has been modernized into a more Dracula, more palatable for a more modern group.
Absolutely. And we love connections too. We love to
We
make
do.
these
We
connections.
do.
And I think that it's, when you hear a story like this that has so many similarities to modern myths that we already cleave to, like the Dracula myth, I think that you want to associate these things. And so the myths evolve to fit our modern context.
Right.
You brought an interesting thing up too, because we were talking earlier about the way this clash between nature and civilization has a great deal to do with the way fairy and human folk interact. One of the other common ways to defeat a fairy or to break the fairy spell was the use of cold iron. Cold iron is one of it's the kryptonite of the fairy world. And it is interesting to note that, of course, iron represents the burgeoning of civilization, and in a way, it's the thing that breaks nature. Whether it's iron weapons or building iron rails or the structure of buildings, it's the core of civilization. So the idea that would be the bane of the fairy world makes perfect sense, even just from a psychological standpoint. And so they say that, for instance, if you wore spurs of iron, that you would be able to defeat a Selkie, for instance, or a Kelpie, for instance. If it's trying to drag you away, you dig your iron spurs into it, and it would actually release you, and it'd be the only way. So it is always interesting. You find these things coming in constantly.
And to put that into a historical context, the idea of using iron weapons against Bronze Age weapons, it's a total mismatch. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So again,
now,
talking about the conquerors.
Now, the last couple of creatures that we have, and we're down to our last 15 minutes because, as always, you and I we cluck on like a couple of old hens here. But the last of our creatures all flow into one another beautifully, because they are, in a sense, this is a trio of creatures that work together, and they are the grimmest, I think, of all of the fairy legends. And we begin with the harbinger of death herself, the Banshee. Now, the Banshee, or you can see that the Irish version of it next to it, the Banshee is literally the fairy woman, or the woman of the other world. It's his literal translation. And this is a creature that is associated with a great deal of evil stories, because the Banshee brings death with it. And it's been said that anyone who hears the cry of the Banshee will die. But the story of the Banshee goes back to an earlier version in which it often belonged to specific families, that each noble family would have an ancestor in its past who became its Banshee, and it would actually warn of impending death rather than cause death. And so it's another creature that's evolved into something a little bit darker than where it began. In fact, Banshees in folklore were often women who either were the victim of a tragedy or had committed some terrible crime. And one of the most interesting versions of that, I think, I've heard, is that Banshees are often women who murder their children and therefore cursed to become an omen or a harbinger of death, and therefore haunt families and warn them of death, which you can certainly connect to a lot of other legends across the world. The one that immediately came to mind when I heard that was La Llorona, the Mexican or Hispanic death spirit, who actually functions very much as a Hispanic variation on the Banshee.
Yes, yes. I think that when we get into Shakespeare, the idea of the three witches in Macbeth can also be seen as Banshee as well, too, because they understand the future and they're associated with that one family. That is the thing that is being lost, because so often whenever somebody spots a Banshee, it's from a royal class of some kind, like the O'Connors or something, and there's that association with that particular clan. And sometimes it's seen, they're seen washing the bloody clothes of someone that's going to be slain in battle, but they have some sort of some sort of knowledge about future events. It's interesting that whenever we deal with the world of the fairy, and this is a whole other show in and of itself, but we also necessarily have to deal with the world of ghosts as well, because the fairy realm is so intrinsically tied to the world of the dead. A lot of times people that have said that they've been taken to the fairy realm actually see their dead relatives there as well too. So the idea that these creatures can straddle two worlds at once is very frightening. And I think that's why fairies can appear in human form, yet they're so unlike us in so many ways. That is really kind of off-putting. Whenever we see something that resembles who we are, but they're made up of a different substance, that really is what kind of makes us uneasy as human beings. So yeah, the fairy, as you said, this is kind of brings everything around. And when we talk about the banshee, which, as you said, just translate into female fairy, you can see, I think, really the origins of where these fairy elements are derived from.
Absolutely. And the thing too about the connection between ghosts and the sort of underworld and fairy is that in Celtic folklore, there's hardly a real difference between the underworld of the fairy and the world of the dead. And you find that these harbingers of death, or these carriers to the underworld, are almost always representatives of the world of the fairy. So Jeff, you're saying, so could the banshee actually be the sound of a storm of winds in Ireland? Absolutely. Again, we always try here to associate sort of the way that people might translate natural phenomena into the myths. You have things like the cries of owls, or or a fox, even the strange cries that they make in the night, and these very, very eerie sounds. If you happen to hear them while a relative was lying in their deathbed, you might think that it was an omen, and you, especially if you sitting by a relative who is, gasping out their last breath. It's one of the reasons that people might often be up in the wee hours of the night at a time you would otherwise be in bed. So more likely to hear these strange, unearthly noises in the night and interpret them that way. So it's a perfectly reasonable idea that may have contributed, at least in some way, to the banshee myth. But the banshee's wail, not only does it serve as an omen of death, but it also summons another of the darkest of spirits from Irish and Celtic folklore, and that would be the coach of Bower. The coach of Bower, the death coach, basically is a hearse which comes to pick up the departing souls. Now, like most of these myths, depending on what era you were listening to the myth, or depending on or the person telling it, sometimes the coach of Bower simply comes to pick up departed souls. Sometimes hearing the rattling of the wheels going down the road can actually lead to your death, and so sometimes it's the cause of death. Sometimes it is just the farrier to the underworld. But this is certainly one of the most frightening and grim spirits, because once the coach of Bower is summoned, it cannot return to the underworld without a soul. So this is one that is deeply feared by people in Celtic mythology.
Mm-hmm. And again, like I said, to connect the dots, you also see this in the Headless Horseman tale as well, too.
Well, you may notice if you look a little more closely here that it's still probably hard to see on a tiny screen, but that coachman, he has no head.
There you go.
This is a very interesting feature, and it's going to lead in just a moment into our final beastie. But yes, the coachman who drives the coach of Bower is a being without a head, and in fact, in some versions of the story, it's even thought that the horses themselves have no heads. Here's a little bit of a better one, and like with the changeling picture, I've zoomed in a bit so that you can see that it is always the case that the driver of the coach of Bower has no head. Now, this is no ordinary coach driver, This is a sort of a side gig. And this side gig of driving the death coach is taken up by probably the darkest of all of the Celtic spirits, probably the most feared. I know I've said that a few times, but this is the one to end all. This is the Dullahan. Now, the Dullahan is one that is near and dear to my heart because I've always been a fan of the Headless Horseman folklore. But the Dullahan is a headless spirit, often considered to be a force of nature, not a human ghost, but a force of nature, literally the force of death itself. And the Dullahan rides through the night brandishing a human spine as a whip. We'll talk about a grim idea, and carrying its head, its disembodied head, in its hand, and it would raise its head up, and the sort of the ignis fatuus, this corpse light shining forth from the eyes and the mouth of the head of the Dullahan, would not only light its path, but any being who is caught by the light of the terrible light streaming forth from the Dullahan's head is doomed to die. So he was a
Very, very
personal
nice.
favorite of mine.
Yep. So, as a student of literature, it was always drilled in my head by various professors that whenever you encounter the iconography of a horse, that represents passions that are that need to be somehow reined in, and the head of a human being represents the reason. So, with these kind of characters, we see that the reason is detached from the humanity and the passions are riding wild. So again, we get to the idea: could this be a personification of forces of nature, something that is out there, unbridled, indiscriminately taking its toll on the living? I think there's something to be said about that as well too. But I think there's something far deeper that hits us on a more psychological and a more primal level, and that is, again, like I said earlier, it's something in human form that looks like us, but it's simply not us. It's a dichotomy where it's recognizable and yet totally hideous and rejected immediately.
And now, interesting thing, of course, about a lot of Celtic folklore is that that over the course of the probably from the what 800s into the 1200s at least, Viking culture and Scandinavian culture was frequently raiding and incorporating themselves and basically ultimately blending with that culture. And so you have some of that bleeds into and ends up becoming part of the Celtic folklore. And the thing about the Doulahan is that it's always struck me as a wonderful representation of the wild hunt. Now, the wild
Mhm.
hunt from Germanic and Scandinavian folklore is a personification in most legends of the god Woden, the great father of the gods, who would ride out at the head of this great spectral hunt, often riding forth in thunderclouds, surrounded by the souls of the dead, hellhounds, and all of the creatures of myth, to go out in search of sinful and wicked souls to harvest. And so he was an aspect of Zeus that, again, was a death bringer. He was a death bringer and a soul collector. And so all of these are variations on the Grim Reaper theme. But as Germanic myth evolved, more and more of these headless horsemen and headless spirits became fairly common. And there's going to be a future episode, I promise you, where we discuss the headless horseman, the American headless horseman myth in great length, because that's a personal favorite of mine as well. But in Germanic myth, you have like Hans Jägenteufel is a great myth. It was collected by the Brothers Grimm. It literally means Hans the Devil Huntsman, and he was another headless spirit who would actually wander through the woods looking for sinners or people who committed crimes. And if he could basically get you to confess your crime, you would be shriven. You would be, sort of saved. But if you denied your crime, he would be able to collect your soul. And he was actually originally an evildoer himself who'd accidentally killed someone and becomes cursed to become this headless spirit. And in a lot of this old folklore, headlessness itself represents evil doing. Someone drew the conclusion at one point, or the interesting connection, that if in life you committed a crime that would have gotten you beheaded, and somehow you're not forced in life to pay the price for it, that you are forced after death to wander the world headless to pay the penance for your crime. And so even in that way, the Doulahan sort of represents this headless spirit who is his penance is to collect the souls of other evildoers, which I have to admit doesn't sound like an entirely bad job, but how much can you really enjoy your afterlife without a head? So
Without a head, yeah. It seems like a cool gig. I mean, you can save all of your money. You're not going to be going out to eat.
that's true. That is very true. But hard to get a date that way too.
Oh my goodness, the weird and wonderful world of Celtic mythology, eh?
I do love it, I have to say. So, folks, I want to thank you all who joined us this evening. We're coming very close up on the 9 o'clock hour here. Before we go, want to remind you folks once again, if you're enjoying these broadcasts, please don't forget to subscribe to us. So subscribe, a like on our channel, share it with your friends if you think interested as well. Next week, I believe what we were discussing, we were going to maybe do the Loch Ness Monster a little bit more in depth. We talked about
Yep.
see a little bit during our cryptids episode, but I'm sure that that's a story that deserves a little bit of a deep dive. Once again, if you're interested in Ron or my work, you can find us online. I have a website called ghostboypress.com. And of course, you're always welcome to stop by. And I have a book on the legend of the Headless Horseman, books on vampires, and other sort of folklore, which I'd be happy to sign copies for you. So let us know. But folks, thank you so much, as always, for doing this on Monday Night Monsters. Ron, thank you, as always, for keeping things moving along and for your wonderful expertise.
My pleasure. I have a great time every time I come here, guys. Every time.
So, folks, until next week, enjoy the remainder of your Sunday night, and we will see you next Monday.
Monday night. Enjoy the remainder of your. I thought that was a great